In this video, we're going to be painting a mini using stippling and texture, with a very limited colour palette to really focus on the techniques to get a stunning result. So, get your paints and let's get started. The paints I've used are on screen now. I've tried to keep it the most commonly available paints, that being Citadel. We all have our favourite paint brands though. The base of the mini is just a basic texture paint. I've used a scale 75 one, but you could use Strickland Battlemire or Battlemud for this to get the same effect. We prime the model in black. We then come in with a zenithal highlight of white from two directions. Firstly, from the side to make the directional highlight, and secondly, from above to position the ambient light. This is, however, mostly so that the brain is just painted white, easier for later. We start with a base coat of Deathworld Forest. Do as many thin coats as it takes to get a smooth base layer. For me, this usually ends up being about 3 coats. We want to pick out all the areas of the mini which in a traditional Tyranid process would just be covered with contrast paint. So this is the main body, not the chitin. While this layer is going down, let's define what stippling is. Stippling is the process of adding dots or speckles to build up texture and transitions between colours. This should give you a good idea of what we're going to be doing today. After we have the base coat down on model, we're going to work on getting the base down on the carapace. For this, we're going to be using a mix of 50-50 Caliban Green and Corvus Black. Again, take your time here, and we really want to make sure we get a nice smooth application. Again, 3 thin coats here for me. We're doing this early to get the messy parts of the process done and out the way. This is good practice in general. If you're working on a mini which has a lot of areas which need to be covered with the same colour, if you can do it with a big unpointed brush, do it earlier in the process. This is what we end up with after we've base coated the mini. We are going to stipple on our first highlight layer using Elysian Green and Deathworld Forest in a 50-50 mix. We're going to be focusing these highlights in the same places we had covered in white during the zenithal. We can use a big brush to cover at this stage here, as we're still early in the process with wide highlights. We don't need a sharp point for this either, so feel free to use an older brush. I'm using one of my cheaper synthetic brushes. While stippling, I am imagining the brush as a sponge. How would I apply the paint to the model if I was using a sponge instead of a brush? Would I be dragging my sponge across the model, or would I be dabbing at it? Don't worry too much about coverage at this stage here, if there's the odd dot of dark showing through. This is really not going to add much in later off. As we build the layers up, this is more than likely going to be covered, so it's probably not even going to survive through to the end. I'm leaving a tiny bit of extra footage here just to sit down and show you where I'm applying the highlights in different areas. We come in with pure Elysian Green for our second highlight. We follow the exact same process as the previous layer, but we are covering less space. Our aim is to keep the highlight fully contained within the previous layer's highlight. Try and keep the position of the highlights so they are not islands of colour. Bias the colour towards the top and don't drop it down as low. This creates a better feel in the mini as it reflects how light works in reality. Now, at this stage here, depending on the size of our first highlight, we might need to come down in a brush size. However, that's probably not going to be the case. Because we kept the first layer quite wide, we can probably still use the same big brush we did before. We now mix in a bit of Sarabite Green into the Elysian Green to add our final highlight to the body. This is about a 50-50 mix again. Now, the third highlight here is the last highlight we're doing. Again, we want to keep the process the same as the previous one, so keeping the highlight fully contained within the previous layer. However, at this stage here, we're almost doing what we would call a specular highlight. A specular highlight is the position in which the main light source is coming from, like seeing a reflection of the sun on a mirrored surface. There will be more on this in future videos. But at this stage here, just keep your highlight to maybe 1 or 2 dots in certain places to sit down and really sell the look. Tyranid carapace is traditionally painted with small lines on the end of this. To do this, we want to start with the paintbrush at the point at which we want the line to end, and then pull towards the edge of the carapace. I'm using a mix of 50-50 Caliban Green and Moot Green. For this, we want to make sure the brush we have has a very nice point to it. So get the brush that has the nicest point and let's get started. We draw each line one after the other without dragging our brush across the mini at all. We just pull it towards the edge. Take your time with practicing this motion, as these scratchy lines are going to be used in later processes to help us blend. especially when we get to glazing in future videos. This is kind of a cheat to glazing, as it means you can use fewer layers later to get a very good effect. We can now work on the next layer. I'm going lighter again and using pure Moot Green. And make sure this layer is fully contained within the previous layer. You'll notice I'm not just painting lines along the edges, but also on some of the high points on the carapace. This is just to add a bit more visual interest to the large surfaces. Remember as well that claws are likely made out of the same material as the carapace, so we want to make sure we're highlighting them as well. We continue with our final layer of highlighting on the carapace, this time using Moot Green and Caliban Green in a 50-50 mix. Don't highlight every surface with this, rather focus the ones towards the top and to the face of the mini. This is going to draw the viewer's eye towards the focal points. This is now all of the green finished on the Neurogaunt, and we can move on to the brain. Hopefully yours looks something like this. Don't worry if it's too far off, we're all here to learn. What would you do different next time, now that you've watched it through and tried it once? With the armour finished, it's now time to work on the brain. For this, we're going to create a contrasting but pleasant look, so we're going to be working with magentas. Now, we're going to come in over the zenithal with Emperor's Children. Build up the layers again and focus on the brush control to keep the colour on the brain. Remember, we want to do multiple thin coats here. For me, I actually had to use about 4 or 5 coats to get a full opaque finish. We are again going to focus on stippling to create the organic texture on the brain. So, remember what we've gone through on the body and let's repeat the processes. We are now going to wash the brain with Screamer Pink. Mix it with a fair bit of water to create a wash and focus this into the recesses of the brain. Notice how the high points of the brain are also slightly stained pink to get them a bit more of a rich colour. After the wash is dry, with Emperor's Children and white in a 50-50 mix, we start to stipple in the highlights. This time, however, we are looking to create islands of colour, so make sure the centre of each brain fold is darker than the edges. Cover about 50% of each fold. This way, we just slightly soften the transition between the dark Screamer Pink and the slightly lighter Emperor's Children. Finally, we come in with pure white just to add the final highlight. Cover maybe 10% of the previous layer. We really don't need much at all. A little pure white goes a long way. And with that, the mini is done and we can move on to painting the base. We're doing a nice, simple base here. The base was done very simple again, as this is not the main focus here. Starting off, we cover the texture paste with a base coat of Deathworld Forest. We then wash it back with Corvus Black diluted with water. We then start to dry brush by building up the layers. Mixing in Moot Green into the base in a 50-50 mix, we do a quick dry brush. We then mix in a bit of Emperor's Children for a final dry brush to the base. The rocks were also painted very simply. We cover them quickly in Corvus Black before we mix into the Corvus Black about a 50-50 mix with Emperor's Children, and we use this to highlight up the rocks. We keep the lines nice and scratchy here, same as we did with the carapace. The tendrils were painted very simply, base coated with Screamer Pink before we highlight up with Emperor's Children towards the top. Finally, we add a tiny bit of white into the Emperor's Children just to pick out the highest points. We then finish everything off by just quickly painting the outside of the base rim with the Corvus Black. And there we have it, the mini is done. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and I hope it's a bit of a step up from my previous ones. If it's helped you out or you've learned something new, please don't forget to give us a like, and if you've really liked it, subscribe. Hopefully next month there'll be more interesting minis to paint and we can continue our journey in paint.